Bon après-midi, mesdames et messieurs. Buenas tardes, damas y caballeros. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Sung-Hoon Kim, and I'd like to welcome you to the International Civil Aviation Organization's 40th Assembly SkyTalks. During the course of a 2-week period, we have 68 presentations for you from aviation industry professionals, and I would welcome all of you to check out the ICAO site on YouTube, ICAO channel on YouTube. Today we continue this is actually day 4, session number 8, and we continue our discussion on the IQTRIP program, which is the Traveler Identification Program. The topic of today is the passenger data exchange, and the person to give you the presentation is Mr. Anthony Frederick, Associate here at ICAO TRIP Program Officer. So please welcome Anthony Frederick.
Thank you. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Assembly, the 40th session, and the SkyTalks. As you have heard, we have had 68, or we will have 68 sessions, and my presentation this afternoon on passenger data exchange will just be one of those sessions. Passenger data exchange within recent times has been very topical. In fact, it has been one of the most discussed, I would say, subject in our area in the facilitation section. This is in line with certain United Nations Security Council resolution. So this afternoon, my presentation will take you through some very basics of passenger data exchange. Passenger data. So what is passenger data? We have all heard of passenger data in the airports, or on the television, in our conferences, in our meeting, a symposium, and different forums, I'm sure. Passenger data generally is or reflective of electronic data that concerns a passenger's identity or travel reservations, which is used by border control authorities to facilitate border control, or in some cases, law enforcement. There are 2 types of data sets. One set of data that is attained or garnered from the machine-readable zone of the passport, and information that is gleaned or garnered from the passenger reservation. And these data we will go through this afternoon very briefly. Passenger data is a useful tool for border control authorities and law enforcement agencies for many different purposes. We will cover some of those as we go through this afternoon. So what are the objectives of exchanging data, or data exchange objectives? 1, it enhances security. And we look at security, not just national security, but also aviation security. It improves clearance at border controls, fight against terrorism, combat illegal migration, identify passengers who are known security threat. And we'll go into a little bit more of this later on. And allows risk assessment and analysis, one of the key areas of data exchange. Advanced passenger information, or API as we commonly refer to it. So what is API, or advanced passenger information? API consists of biographical data about passengers. Biographical data tends to suggest name, date of birth, nationality. As I mentioned before, an API, these are data that are captured from the machine-readable zone of the passport or other MRTDs used in air travel. API data also comprises or contains or consists of other information concerning specific flight involved. For example, the departure of the flight, the number of the flight, the scheduled time of arrival, and other information that is obtained from the airlines or the aircraft operators' departure control system. This information is transmitted or transferred to border agencies as the aircraft depart, or as near as once the aircraft depart. And the agencies that receive this data, as we will see later on in the presentation, are a myriad. There's a myriad of agencies that use this data or like to use this data where law permits. The data is generated during checking. It is contained or reserved within the departure control system of the air carrier. And in many cases, for those who are very traveled, will recognize that sometimes at the point of departure, you have persons who have checked in for a particular flight, and at the gate, there's a no-show. So it is imperative that the data is transmitted as close as possible to the departure, probably when the aircraft closes or the door of the departure lounge is closed for that specific flight, to ensure that all the data is transmitted. API may also apply to airlines operating in or departing a state, or in some cases for overflights. We have seen for some states, an aircraft overflying their territory, they require the information. Crew API may also be required in some cases, and if so, they are transmitted separately. Now, on the issue of transmitted, here we are talking about the transfer of data. So API data is transmitted primarily by two means. One, which is referred to as legacy or batch API. This is where, or the most commonly used method, I should say, this is where at the close-up of the flight or the information that's been sent is sent in one batch containing a list of all the passengers on that specific flight, as we commonly know, maybe the passenger manifest. And that is the most common means. Then we have interactive API or IAPI. This is a bit more complex, more costly as well, but this is one of the benefits of technology. IAPI allows the aircraft operators to send the information on the passenger in real life time and receive a response immediately, or almost immediately, so to speak. So in response, the airline gets a board or no board response and allows them to either put the passenger on the flight or not. So IAPI is one of the methodology or the techniques that are used for transferring data. And we will cover a little bit more about the benefits of the data as we move along. So what are some of the benefits of API data? It provides information about a person's identity. And earlier I mentioned about a person's name, nationality, and date of birth. And it could include information on type of passport, the issuing state of the passport, the expiration date of the passport, and so on. It helps identify people you know about. So for example, the API data is sent to the relevant authority of a state who is under law authorized to receive the data, look at the information, and for example, you're traveling through a particular state 10 times per month or 10 times per year, they know you. They've seen your name, and it's easy. And it allows for another process to take place, which we will cover later on. Border integrity, it helps to improve border control and to combat irregular migration more effectively. And today we know for a fact that there is a lot of concerns with irregular migration, which links, has some links to human trafficking and so on. That's a topic for another issue on another day, because we can stand here for 2 weeks and not yet cover the full topic. Facilitation, it leads to a faster processing of bona fide travelers. And this is important. For most of us, again, who have traveled, you would not like to think that you are transiting an airport or arriving at an airport and standing in a line with 1,000 passengers or so in front of you and having to queue for 1, 2, or 3 hours. So the information that used by the relevant authorities allow for this faster processing of bona fide travelers, while they can focus their resources on those passengers who need to be focused on. And it also improves the perception of security by the citizens. Efficiency allows for the reduction of the workload of border management officers through the use of technology and automated means. Now, there is this notion that once you introduce technology, I don't need me anymore. The idea is, the concept is that technology today can be the best ally of our human, particularly in an environment where time is of the essence, time is of money, time is of security, to reduce the congestion, the security concern, to keep the passengers moving so that the airlines can make money, and so on. International information sharing. API complements existing data vetting processes, such as checking passengers' passport against watch lists and the Interpol databases. For example, Annex 9, in Annex 9, it's obligatory for member states to use the Interpol databases for checking travel documents. And this links to another area of the ICAO facilitation program, which is the public key directory. It's not my forte, so I would not go into it, but I encourage you to probably peruse the ICAO website and see where you can obtain this information. I will provide some information at the end from websites where you can find invaluable information that will help you. Annex 9 SOPs, or Standards and Recommended Practices. Annex 9, ICAO's role primarily here for this particular discussion is to establish the international regulatory framework for passenger data exchange systems. Interestingly, Annex 9, 26th Amendment, which became effective in February of last year, introduced an entire chapter, Chapter 9, that deals with passenger data exchange. And this standards and recommended practices that are contained here establishes that legal framework that I just mentioned for passenger data exchange. It goes into API, Advanced Passenger Information, PNR, Passenger Name Records, and ETS, Electronic Travel Systems. And I encourage you to, if you're not familiar with it, to familiarize yourself with that particular chapter. So the implementation of Annex 9 are essential to facilitate clearance of aircraft, passengers, and their baggage. And of course, we cannot forget cargo and mail. Like a colleague of mine said, in security, we close the front door and we forget the back door open. So we cannot forget, we focus everything that is in the cabin of the aircraft, but not necessarily in the belly of the aircraft or the whole of the aircraft. So remember, cargo and mail. To manage challenges in border controls and airport processes so as to maintain both security and the efficiency of air transport operations. It also integrates functions of agencies related to border control. And again, we are very familiar with the airport environment, and the border control environment includes a myriad of different agencies: immigration, customs, police, intelligence agencies, and the list goes on and on. And of course, within every unit of, for example, intelligence agencies, you have the subdivisions and units, and those that are specialized, and everybody is doing a different task. Everyone needs to have access to the information. So it helps. It requires interagency and cross-border cooperation to implement Annex 9 obligations. And you will see and I'm referring specifically to Chapter 9 in Annex 9, and there are provisions that require interagency communication and coordination, one agency sharing information with another agency across borders. Because we are talking here about dealing with issues of transnational concerns, not just national concerns. So it is important in the nature or the context of transnational that there is interagency cooperation between these different agencies of the state. So Annex 9, Chapter 9 also contains provisions for API data. And this is a general provision that is on the screen. Recommended practice 9.1 establishes that contracting states requiring the exchange of advanced passenger information or interactive or IAPI, as I mentioned earlier, IAPI, and or passenger name record data from aircraft operators should create a passenger data single window facility for each category of data. So what is the passenger data single window about? Passenger data single window facility generally is where a state establishes one point or one source or one recipient for collecting data from the different airlines. In many states, we have different agencies authorized by law to collect and use certain data. So think about it. As an aircraft operator, you have to send information to 9 or 10 different agencies within a state. It's a cost to transmit the data, one. It's also a burden on the state to be able to read the data being sent by the aircraft operators in 10 different facilities or 10 different units. So it is a cost. So the concept here is to establish the single window where states can receive data into one. It will also allow the aircraft operators to transmit the data at least to one agency for one time. So the passenger data single window, and we'll go into it a little bit more in the presentation. Importantly, this provision that is a recommended practice in Amendment 26 to Annex 9 has been upgraded to a standard in Amendment 27, which is expected to become effective on the 21st of October this year, so in a couple of weeks. So this will now become a standard, and states will be obligated to establish this passenger data single window facility. Chapter 9 also contains a section B that deals with advanced passenger information, and these two standards should be taken together. Standard 9.5 establishes that a contracting state shall establish an advanced passenger information system. So this means that it's a shall, it's a standard, it becomes mandatory for states unless a state files a difference under Article 38 of the Convention. This provision is also in line with United Nations Security Council Resolution 2178, paragraph 9, which calls on member states to request or to have their airlines or the aircraft operators operating to provide API data. However, as I said, it is important that 9.5 and 9.6 be taken together to allow a state to lawfully establish passenger data passenger data exchange systems. It is important to have the most suitable and appropriate legal framework to support not only the collection but the use of such data. And there is a key element here in the last line that says, and be consistent with internationally recognized standards for API. So again, the regulations, the laws, or the statute decree, as you may have, should also establish standards that are recognized internationally. And for example, we will go into some of them. We have standards established by the United Nations, and we have those that are endorsed by ICAO, IATA, and the World Customs Organization, and so on. Annex 9 SAPs on API continued. We have recommended practice 9.7, which again talks about legislation being developed and taking into consideration that the regulations meet the needs of all the agencies involved. I remember I told you that there's a number of agencies working in the airport environment, and each agency should have the legal remit to collect such data and to use such data. And here again in the last line, or last part, you would see it refers to one government agency to receive API data on behalf of all agencies. And from the economical standpoint, we have seen some regions not just establish one government agency nationally, but regionally. So this is another perspective can be considered. Recommended practice 9.14 talks about each contracting state should consider the introduction of an interactive Advanced Passenger Information System. Unlike API under standard 9.5 that is mandatory, IAPI is not yet mandatory. It's a recommended practice. Although some states, as you would see in a later slide, are already implementing IAPI. So we change focus a bit. We move away from API and we look at the other set of data, and we look at passenger name record. What is passenger name record data, or PNR data? PNR is a generic name given to the records created by aircraft operators or authorized agents for all segments of the journey. PNR is commercial data supplied by or on behalf of passenger concerning all flight segments of the journey. PNR generally is commercial data collected by the airlines or aircraft operators for their own commercial purposes. PNR data includes changes to requested seating, special meals. So for example, a person may have a request that is outside of the norm. For example, maybe a wheelchair, as I say, a special seating. This information is included in the PNR. And there is much more other information that can be collected, keeping in mind that PNR data may appear different from different carriers and may have different data elements, although it's governed by the UN EDIFACT based guidelines. So what are the benefits of PNR data? Traditionally, it was developed for customs to identify contraband and smuggling routes. Today, to prevent terrorism and organized crime, as well as other activities undertaken by law enforcement agencies. It plays an important role in risk assessment and analysis, and it helps states to identify unknown or suspicious persons or people. Trends or patterns such as unknown travel routings and connections among individuals, as well as between individuals and entities. And links can be made with one entity or a person purchasing, or persons purchasing tickets from one entity at the same time, maybe the same routing and so on. Annex 9 SAPS on PNR data also has some other provisions, and we would look at 9.22.1, which establishes that contracting states requiring the PNR data shall adopt and implement the EDIFACT-based PNR Gov message. And I just mentioned to you that the EDIFACT, it's generally the electronic data interchange for administrations, commerce, and transport. And this is a standard by the UN. This has been adopted by or endorsed by ICAO, IATA, and WCO. So it says that this is a standard that should be used for transferring or transmitting API data. Recommended practice 9.23, contracting states requiring PNR data should consider the data privacy impact of PNR data collection and electronic transfer within their own national system. And the issue of data privacy is another issue for another 10 days or 10 months. We can go on and on and on the issue of data privacy. API and PNR implementation. So we look at some of the implementation issues. So in addition to the provisions of Annex 9, UN Security Council Resolution 2178 also calls upon states to request API, as well as the UN Security Council Resolution 2396 that requires API, and more importantly, urges ICAO to work with its member states to establish a standard for the collection, use, processing, and protection of PNR data. To facilitate this work, a dedicated PNR task force has been established by ICAO to consider proposals for the development of the SAPS on collection, use, processing, and protection of PNR in line with the resolution. So API and PNR implementation, we can see data obtained from the IATA API PNR World Tracker system. We have approximately 70 states have API in force. 16 of them are interactive, and you can read from the slide to see the other numbers. And on PNR, we have so far 27 states that are using API and the PNR, sorry. Very briefly, the IQTRIP strategy. I guess most of us are familiar with the IQTRIP strategy. And the IQTRIP strategy is recognized for its contributions to the UN Security Council resolutions. Within the strategy itself, there are 5 key elements. And we highlighted here the last one, which is, or the 5th element, which is interoperable applications, where API and PNR falls under. And there is much more on the ICAO website on the IQTRIP strategy. API and PNR implementation, the initial steps, determine agencies that require the use of API and PNR data, establish a national legal framework, establish a national air transport facilitation committee, create passenger data single window, and of course, as I mentioned before, the issue of cost if you have one single entity doing this. Include stakeholders very early, very key to ensure that stakeholders are involved. Of course, international cooperation, there is the avenue for technical assistance and other assistance with regard to implementation through ICAO, the UN, WCO, and IOM. Consider budgetary constraints and funding, of course. There is also the capability or the opportunity for bilateral assistance. And flexibility, your system must be flexible. Be able to adapt to new and current changes in the system or changes in data elements that are required by states. And as I mentioned to you, these are a few guidelines that you can look for on the ICAO website that will help member states implement API and PNR. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you. That brings me to the end of the presentation this afternoon. I will now probably take questions or two, if any.
If there are any questions, I'd like to invite you to come to the mic. Okay, so if you have more questions or concerns regarding this topic or others, please make sure to contact us at mcr@icao.int. Thank you very much, Frederick. Anthony Frederick.